This video is a quick introduction to the sources of the British Constitution, which is why you can see some ketchup, brown sauce and mayo on the front screen of the video. Because the UK Constitution is uncodified and cannot be found in one place, the sources of the British Constitution are quite diverse. The first source of the British Constitution I want to talk to you about is historic documents, and famously it's Magna Carta that we're going to use as our primary example. And if you go to many other countries with a codified constitution like the United States or India, quite often Magna Carta is cited or invoked as part of their constitution. It's seen as an authoritative document, not just in the United Kingdom, but in many, many democracies around the world. And the reason why Magna Carta is so important to the British Constitution is it gave limited rights to a small amount of people against the will of the king. And before that, kings essentially, within reason, political reason, did as they pleased with no real check on their power. And what Magna Carta asserted was that the king simply couldn't make rules arbitrarily, that the monarch couldn't have laws as they wished simply because that's what they wished them to be. They had to guarantee certain rights to their citizens, and that is why Magna Carta is historically a very important document in the British Constitution. Now we've got two other documents in the 17th century. First of all, the Petition of Right, signed in the 1620s under Charles I, and then the Bill of Rights, signed towards the end of the 17th century. And A-level historians in the girls' division will know that this is a period of huge reform of the British Constitution, and I'll talk to you a little bit about them now. The Petition of Right was signed at a time when Charles I was in a particularly difficult part of his reign. His power was limited at this time, and he essentially agreed, amongst other things in the Petition of Right, that Parliament must give their consent to taxation. Prior to the Petition of Right, Charles I had found many different ways and means of getting money out of the British people without getting Parliament to first of all give their consent to it. So amongst many things, that is what the Petition of Right did. But I think the most important part of it for us as a politics class is this idea that Parliament must give consent to taxation, because at this time in the 17th century it was the monarch's job to collect and to spend taxpayers' money. Finally, the Bill of Rights. Now, you mustn't think of this Bill of Rights in the way that the Americans do. It isn't necessarily the same as those first amendments to the US Constitution, which highlight individual rights, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, etc. Once more in the Bill of Rights, Parliament reasserted its position that taxation cannot be collected without Parliament's say-so. It also meant that the king couldn't have an army, particularly during a period of peace, without the consent of Parliament. And it also asserted that the king simply couldn't override and ignore parliamentary law as passed by Parliament. And so we can see what's happening in the 17th century is this at times slow and at times radical shift in power from the power of the monarch, the king, to the power of Parliament to sort of assert its own authority. Secondly, and this is linked to the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, we've got statute law, and that is essentially laws passed in Parliament. As we looked at in a previous video, Parliament has sovereign lawmaking power, particularly since the United Kingdom left the European Union, because prior to that, when the UK was a member, there was this conflict as to what took precedence, European Union law or statute law. But statute law passed by Parliament is supreme and cannot necessarily be ignored in parts of the United Kingdom. And therefore, unless it is specific to one part of the UK, applies equally across it. And as I've said again in a previous video, constitutional law is no different to any other law that is passed. it simply needs the majority of the Commons, the majority of the Lords, and then the consent of the monarch, which has been given for nigh on 300 years. It needs those three things to become part of the law. There is no special process like there is in the USA. In the USA, if you want to change the constitution, it's a 2/3 majority of each house and 3/4 of the state legislatures that need to confirm a change to the constitution. But statute law is passed just by an act of parliament, and when it refers to the constitution, there's no sort of additional checks. So we've got the Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949, which limited the power of the House of Lords, and that will be covered in greater depth in the Parliament topic. But essentially what it meant is that the veto power of the Lords became the delay power of the Lords, and the Lords can now only send legislation back to the Commons to be reconsidered twice. Then we've got the Representation of the People Act, and there were many versions of this passed. In 1918, we see the first time that women are granted the right to vote, married women with property over the age of 30. In 1928, we get equal suffrage, where women and men over the age of 21 have the right to vote. The key difference between those two acts is men over the age of 21 were granted the right to vote in 1918, but a woman had to be married, meet property qualifications, and be over the age of 30. So we get equal suffrage between the sexes in 1928. And then in 1969, the voting age is lowered from 21 to 18. So the rights of citizens are being changed by a simple act of parliament, and so a huge contributor in terms of the sources of the UK Constitution, and in my opinion, the most important, is statute law. Next up is what we call common law, essentially law that has been made through judicial decisions. And A.V. Dicey, who we looked at in a previous video, and we will be looking at again in this one, once said that the English Constitution is judge-made. And in the absence of a Bill of Rights, as they have in America, our rights, freedom of expression, and our limited freedom of speech, that's ironic, not being able to say the word speech, freedom of speech, those rights come from decisions made historically in the courts. And so when matters of an individual's freedom of speech arise in the court, they refer to the precedent set by these previous judicial decisions. So another factor is what we call common law. Another factor is authoritative works or works of authority. And these are essentially the musings, the work of political theorists and scholars of the Constitution. Now, the only one I really want you to have in your mind is A.V. Dicey. I told you he'd be coming up again, and here he is, with works like The Law of the Constitution. This was an attempt by Dicey to pull together centuries of traditions and conventions and decisions made in the courts. It was an attempt to bring it all together to explain the true nature of the British Constitution. And this is why we should never refer to our Constitution as unwritten, because very many of the sources, like the works of authority, like statute law, many of them are in fact written down. So works of authority that we can rely upon when we look at sort of the rules of the game of the British Constitution, or we can refer to people like Dicey, those historic experts, and how they saw the rules of the game in the British political system. The final source of the British Constitution that I want to talk to you about is convention. And when I think of that word convention, automatically I think to a comic book convention or whatever it may be, a meeting of people who share a similar interest. But when we're talking about conventions in the Constitution, we're essentially talking about these accepted rules of the game. And you know what, us Brits stereotypically love to play by the rules, don't we? You know, Europeans marvel at the way that we insist on queuing and these sorts of things. We have this preoccupation with, we do things this way because that's the way it's done. And that's the interesting thing with constitutional conventions is it's essentially not got any grounding in law. It's got no authority in the law. So let me give you some examples of constitutional conventions. First up, royal assent. I've mentioned it a few times now when we look at Parliament and the passage of legislation, and again when we look at essentially the role of the monarch in the Constitution. Royal assent is given to bills as a matter of fact, as a matter of convention. There is nothing to say that Queen Elizabeth II or any future monarch can turn around and begin to reject legislation. But because of the convention that the monarch does not play a political role and does not side with any political party or ideology, because the monarch is beyond politics, there is a convention that the monarch grants royal assent to every bill that appears before them. Now, if these conventions, are sort of ignored, there's no way for a court or for Parliament to do anything about it. So, for example, if the government loses a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons, it is convention that cabinet, that government resigns. There is no rule, there is no steadfast law to say that if a government loses a vote of no confidence, then they must resign. It's a convention. It's part of the Constitution that is the done thing. It's the way that it's the rules of the game. That these rules aren't written down anywhere. They've got no legal authority. But it is assumed that is what will happen. And as I said, if we found ourselves, with a prime minister that didn't play by the rules of the game, that disrespected and had no respect for or admiration for the British Constitution, they can break conventions such as those, and there would be no real or physical comeback, particularly in a legal sense. I'm sure it would hurt that political party at the next election. But the whole idea with conventions is that these are the accepted rules of the game. As I said, that the Queen gives royal assent, or the monarch, I should say, gives royal assent to every bill, and that has happened for over 300 years now, and that the government must resign when they lose a vote of no confidence in Parliament. The idea that the Prime Minister must come from the House of Commons is, again, convention. Alec Douglas-Home, who resigned or sort of left the Lords and stood in a by-election and became a member of the Commons in order to serve as a Conservative Prime Minister in the 1950s. There was no steadfast rule that he did that. There was no legal requirement for him to do that. It was simply convention. These centuries-old accepted ideas of this is how we do things around here. And as I said, no legal authority, but over a long period of time, there is this idea of what is and isn't accepted behaviour. Okay, as I do at the end of every one of these videos, a quick recap of our sources of the Constitution. Number 1, historic documents such as Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, the Bill of Rights. Number 2, statute law, laws passed by Parliament. Number 3, common law. Unlike statute law, common law is very, very rarely established as written law, but common law are the way that rights have been granted to and limited to British citizens, and they are decisions made in British courts of law. Then we've got works of authority, and I gave the example of Dicey's The Law of the Constitution, and then finally conventions. These accepted behaviours that actually aren't written down and have legal authority, but simply happen as a result of tradition. And this is why we refer to an uncodified, not an unwritten constitution. You can see that it's uncodified because it's coming from a range of places. But actually, Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, the Bill of Rights were written. The law of the Constitution by Dicey, written down. Statute law, written down. So it's not, although elements of the Constitution, elements of common law and convention, although they aren't written, it's not accurate to refer to the British Constitution as unwritten. So I would much rather you referred to the Constitution in your answers as uncodified. Now, usually I say at the end of this video, do what you want, make notes, don't, do as you please. And I continue to say that, but one thing that I think may be useful when you're looking back at these sources of the Constitution is I want you to rank them in order of importance. In terms of these sources and where our political world in the UK comes from, I want you to rank them top to bottom. Which do you think are the most significant? And first of all, you need to think about what that means when we talk about the significance of them. Is it where are the most important decisions made? How are the biggest and most significant changes to the Constitution? Where are they decided? You might want to take a historic perspective and say, okay, well, the convention that the monarch doesn't give royal assent, for example, is only 300 years old, whereas Magna Carta has existed since the 13th century. So that sort of establishment has a greater, longer history. So first of all, you need to define significant and then rank them in order of their significance. I think that would be a useful exercise to do.